All right, well, welcome to week 6 of fall semester 2025. Man, this semester's moving. It's all starting to blend together a little bit for me, so I'm trying to keep everything straight as we go through these classes. So today I want to begin with Islam. I think I ended with that last week of talking about the idea of how Islam really took off. They took a big advantage of the times because the Byzantine and Sassanid empires had kind of worn themselves out in fighting, so they were able to come in and really take over. This was the Umayyad Caliphate, or the Umayyad Empire, if you will. Kind of, they grew up and took over the area. They went across North Africa all the way into Spain and got across the Strait of Gibraltar and up into Spain as well. The thing that's really fascinating about this is, this is interesting because this is the first time that really Islam as a religion has had to become a nation. So this is so different because, we don't realize that in order to run a nation, you have to have laws and rules and, police to enforce things and deal with sanitation and, changes in climates and other things going on, and not to mention have a standing army to deal with invaders, and then have a way to deal with local issues as well as national issues. And there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure that you have to run a nation. And so Islam has to now grow their way of thinking to go, okay, we need to be able to think like governmental leaders now, not just a religious group, which hasn't had to think about sanitation and other stuff quite as much. So there's a lot of changes they go through during the Umayyad Empire, or Umayyad time of the Caliphate. At this time as well, they basically start learning from the Sassanids and Byzantines, and as they're taking over these groups, they start learning from these groups, going, well, how did they do it? What did they do? Oh, well, let's just do that then. That's great. Now, one of the things that they had that gave them a big advantage was in Egypt, there's a city named Alexandria. And if you're familiar with Alexandria, it was named after, yes, Alexander the Great. But here's the thing that's interesting is they began what we could call the world's first major library. There were smaller groups of documents all over the place, but they tried to bring like everything from the world together into one place where you could just come down to Alexandria, go to the library, and like see all kinds of documents and information from all over the world. And the Islamic groups, as they conquered this, they took advantage of this opportunity and they studied and they learned. So one thing that's important to always understand about Islam is seeking knowledge is a key important facet of Islamic religion. Studying and learning is important. This is why oftentimes you see a lot of people who are lawyers and doctors and professors and others in Islam, because they put a huge value on education, the importance of learning and moving things around in your learning as well. So like learning from other people and disseminating that information out. So they were on a trend that put them in a very similar place as China. And I took a class about a year ago, just over a year ago, on it was summer of 24, that I did a class on the history of China, which was really fascinating. They were a couple of centuries ahead of everybody else for a long time. And Islam was moving in that direction as well, where China and Islam were becoming two of the smartest world powers. They were easily outdoing everything in England and up in the European continent area. They a lot of superstitions, a lot of things were happening up in that area that, this ideas of like magic and other stuff were happening as Christianity was moving that way as well. But the Islamic religion and the China's ideas and philosophies were really ahead of their times at this point. They were really accelerating wisdom and knowledge and learning. So we do actually have to attribute some good credits to these opportunities in time with China and Islam, because they helped us further knowledge quite a bit that was later used to help the rest of society out. Now you might be asking, well, then how did England seem to kind of come out on top of this? Well, that is kind of due to other changes that happen as Islam eventually pulls back, because the Mongol Empire comes over. And this is one of the things we talked a lot about this week, is the Mongol Empire, as they came down and they dominated China, they spread west also. And they came over and ran into the remnants of the Roman Empire as well as Islam, and they started conquering through these areas as well. And so the Mongols weren't that big on education, and so they really did a big setback for China and Islam as far as progress and opportunity. That gave enough of an opportunity for England and the European groups up there to start to really gain a foothold and to grow their wisdom and understanding. But what they learned was from China and Islam, basically, is some of the things that they learned to help them out. So it's just interesting, that dynamic of how things change, sometimes rather quickly over time. You know, when you look at history, we like to look at this smooth line of progression in history, almost like an evolution, when in reality it's this. History is all over, you know, and nations are coming and going and changes are happening, but there's remnants of ideas and concepts that tend to stick around, and those coalesce with other new ideas and concepts, and that's why we end up getting the progression that we do. So it's really fascinating that grew and occurred that way. Now, the Abbasid Empire, or Abbasid Caliphate, was after the Umayyads. Umayyads were seen from an outside perspective as a great empire for Islam. Inside Islam, not everybody was happy about the Umayyads. They were a little oppressive and in some areas and lazy in other areas, and so the Abbasid Empire ended up taking over and getting rid of the Umayyads and taking over the Caliphate. They actually pushed the Umayyads back to Spain. So the Abbasid Empire got back to the Strait of Gibraltar and says, okay, you guys stay on that side, we'll stay on our side, and we'll be good. And so the Abbasids came in and took over. The thing to understand, though, is as the Abbasids came in and took over as the next major caliphate of Islam, it wasn't perfectly uniform. There were still small groups and tribes and factions inside that large empire that influenced them. One of them that was really interesting that we actually spent some time talking about this week was a group. I'm trying to remember the name off the top of my head. But so one of the things that happened in Abbasid Empire, let me kind of set the stage for this, is the Abbasid Empire, the Caliphate said, you know, we kind of need a standing army. You know, we just took over the Umayyads and they didn't have a really good standing army. We really need to have something to kind of protect the Caliphate, protect the government from invasions and other issues and things that are happening. So they wanted to create a defense against what they did to gain power, basically. And so they created their own standing army to help protect the caliphate and the governmental head. And they did this by going to the Turks and basically acquiring Turkish slaves. So these are young men who were in slavery that they were buying up, and then they were just basically disciplining and training them to be a standing army for the caliphate. And kind of not quite like a secret service type idea, but it'd be more like a national guard for the government. And so that they had the standing army, and they wanted to use this army to help in dealing with challenges within the organization, within the nation, the Abbasid Caliphate. One of those came from the eastern end of the empire. Towards the east, in what we'd call like present-day Iran area, that's part of where the Silk Road was coming through. So a lot of trade with Byzantine areas and China and the European areas. And the Caliphate said, we want a piece of that economic puzzle there. We want to be into that. So they pushed east to take over a bunch of areas, but they were struggling. And so they sent this army, this little special army, in to take it over. And this special army gets in there and starts to take over everything and realizes, why don't we just set this up as our own nation? And so they end up basically breaking off from the Abbasid empire to an extent and kind of creating their own little space there. They just commandeered that part of the empire and says, no, we're going to be our own sovereign nation. And as they pushed out, they were a bit of an extremist group. And as they pushed out, they influenced the Silk Road trade to the north, but they also went east and southeast towards India. So into present-day Pakistan and up into northwest India. The challenge there was a bit of a problem they saw in India, because India is predominantly Hinduism. Now, Hinduism is a religious philosophy, a religion that basically believes in what's known as the caste system. And what that means is when you are born, there are different types of people, different levels of superiority in people. And when you're born into a class of people, whether that's the ruling class, which were your religious and military leaders, whether that was more of your governmental class people, or middle class, or poor, or slaves, whatever. There was these different classes of people that you could be in. You're born into the class you're in. You are not to change classes. You can't move up. Although I think there were actually, if I remember my Chinese class, we talked a little bit about this, that there were actually people who did progress. Oftentimes women would get married to men who were in the upper class, and that would move them up. But there were sometimes exceptions to that rule, but it was very strict and rigid. You stayed in your class. You married in your class. You did everything in your class. You didn't go outside of your class. So this idea, so in a way, some people today might see this as some kind of a class racism, economic racism, but this was the caste system that they used. And it was a very rigid system that allowed for some harmony and opportunities in India for their government and their economy to run really smooth, because it defined how far you could go. They made it work really well for them. Well, when this group from Ghazniyad's, I think is what they were called, followers of Ghazni, they came down with this extremist Islamic idea. They met with these Hindus and went, dude, you can't do that. See, in Islam, we believe that you can move up and down the class structure. We believe you can go from a smaller class to a higher class, that there's more equality among people, and you have upward mobility opportunities and things based upon your efforts and what you're doing. And so they says, we don't like this idea of this caste, and so we're going to interpret Islam as saying we can persecute you. Even though Muhammad told everybody, even on his deathbed, don't go kill each other, don't go attack each other, learn to work together with other people, learn to do things. And so they were trying to, they basically interpreted Islam as, oh, we can persecute people who are different than us. So they persecuted the Hindus, which turned into a situation that didn't go well, basically, for them. Lots of pushback, lots of issues. So the Hindus now hate the Islamist groups. That hatred still kind of exists today. If you followed anything in India's policy, they literally, Hindus literally just took over an Islamic site and built their own temple, a Hindu temple on it, claiming it was taken over from them from previous times. A lot of animosity still to this day in that area. What's interesting is as this animosity is happening, some of the Islamic groups from the Abbasid Empire were sailing. They were being sailor merchants, and they're moving over into Indonesia, which is more southeast from India. So they're getting into Sumatra, Indonesia, Timor, these island nations that exist just off the coast of Cambodia and those areas. As they're over there, they have these groups of Islamists were more, not as extremist, more flexible in their understanding of Islam. In fact, They brought a type of Islam known as Sufism, which is kind of a mystic type of Islam philosophy of rituals and connections with God and divine and different things. And they came together and they actually ran into the Hindus over there. And this is really interesting because when the Sufi Muslims and the Hindus connected in Indonesia, they looked at each other and went, "Oh, well, you're not super far off from what we believe in some ways, and we're cool to live together. You know, we're flexible in our beliefs and ideas, and you can believe what you believe." And even as Islam emerged and began to take over some of those islands and rule some of those areas, have a strong influence there, they were tolerant of other beliefs and ideas. And then, in fact, Hinduism and Islam started finding common ground and started to come together on their ideas that God is in everything. God is around us. God is all around us. There's a piece of God in us and in the rocks and animals and things, and they're really blended together. So Islam was more accepted and connected, and same with Hinduism, and ended up converting a lot of people because Islam was the started taking over politically in some of those islands. It grew, and people were converting to Islam because if you wanted to be wealthy, if you wanted to have a chance of economic prosperity and avoid the taxes the non-Muslims got, then you wanted to join Islam. So it was more of a economic reason to join Islam at that time. But it grew and thrived, which is very in contrast with what happened in India. So really interesting how different factions and ideas of Islam are emerging and growing and doing things through this time period. So Islam is quite peaceful. I mean, when you get back into the Quran and the ideas of Muhammad, there's a lot of peace in it, but sometimes it gets interpreted to not be as peaceful, to justify what you're doing. And we see this with extremist groups in lots of different throughout its history from religionists. So that's kind of an interesting idea. So we're kind of getting into around 1200s, 1500s AD time frame now. Christianity is doing well in Europe and growing. There's obviously Orthodox Christianity more into Russia. There's Western Christianity or Catholicism in Europe. Islam is seeing these shifts and changes in how they're doing things. You know, China's going through their changes, getting into the Tang dynasty. You know, all kinds of things that are happening in the world. It's amazing how much Islam has really made a difference. Islam almost made it during the Abbasid Empire. They almost made it up into Europe. They got up past Turkey and got up and around that area into like Ukraine and Poland and some of those areas. They got up that way for a little while and then ended up pulling back a little bit. And it's interesting because the Mongols got up there and pushed through, and then they, instead of continuing to invade Europe, they pushed back because Genghis Khan died. Now they had to decide who's going to be the next Khan. And a lot of them pulled back to deal with internal strife in their own empire and never made it back to Europe. So Europe was spared in a lot of ways that way. And then the caliphate came up as well, but then Black Plague started to play a role later on. And so they pulled back too through Ukraine. So it's just fascinating how, in a way, the Black Plague and the death of Genghis Khan saved Europe from becoming an empire of Mongols or even Islam. It was spared from that. Christianity had a window of opportunity to thrive over there because of it. So fascinating how history works out. It's so cool. So there's some fun tidbits and ideas of Islam that are there. It is, by scripture and definition, Islam is a peaceful nation. It's a peaceful religion, but it is sometimes reinterpreted by groups. And so they have extremist groups, they have moderate groups, you know, not uncommon for like Christianity or Judaism or others that we have today as well. So it was a really fun week to learn as we see these other groups that we know in history coming together and how they're interacting and how things are being influenced by each other. So it's fascinating because most people who we think of, you think of like, where is Islam lived and taught the most? We think of the Middle East, but actually when you look at like Indonesia And those islander areas and, by Cambodia and up in that area, way more people are Islamists over there than in the Middle East. So it's really interesting how the dynamic of these religions have shifted and changed over time. There's still a strong presence in the Middle East, and they tend to, because there's a lot of extremists in the Middle East, they tend to be very vocal and get the most attention. But actually, most people that live Islam are actually more in like India and Indonesia and those areas as far as a per capita rate. So just kind of fun. Okay, so let's jump to my class on my religious studies class. Um, I'm trying to remember if I think I mentioned last time that I was shifting my research a little bit more to getting into understanding England and the role that English law played in affecting the worship practices of the LDS members in the 20th century. So that's narrowing it down to thinking about how does law and religion interact with each other to, and then getting like, let's look at like the United States. No, we're going to switch and go outside the United States because there's a lot that's written about the United States. So let's go where it's less written, a little bit harder work, but there's more opportunities for good research. And then shifting it even down to one country, England. So I've been doing a lot of studies on law, the history of law and religion in England, and even just more understanding this. How do scholars look at law and religion? And it's really been fascinating because law and religion oftentimes are seen as coming from each other. They're emerging out of the same space. There's definite classic examples in history of a religion that a nation forms out of it. Like Islam is one of those. Islam was a religion that a nation came out of it. Judaism was a religion that a nation emerged out of it. So this does happen sometimes where the religion it gets established first, and then out of these religious rules and guidelines, a nation forms that governs land and territories and deals with nationwide issues and local issues and other things. But there's also a case later on in history of this changing where a nation is formed and then religion comes out of it. It's like Protestantism was already, the nations of like England and a lot of Europe was already established by the time Protestantism started to come around. Puritanism was a similar type idea with Protestantism. Mormonism, the United States was relatively established. We already had the Constitution and a lot of laws in place by the time Mormonism came around. So we're seeing in more modern times where the nation is first, then the religion happens. So this is an interesting difference because when the religion comes first, the nation often reflects the religious values and views. So the nation's laws come out of religious laws and perspectives. So those nations tend to be more historically, not secular, but more perceived as favoring one perspective of who is God and religion and things at those times. But then we have these other times where a nation is formed and then a religion emerges from within that nation. And these religions have to realize as they grow that we are functioning and emerging within a legal framework. And we have to be sensitive to that legal framework if we want to stay. Otherwise, the laws will go against us and we get persecuted and destroyed. Jehovah's Witness is a organization that has seen tremendous problems with this because some of their beliefs and ideas have gone contrary to the nations that they have membership in. And that's caused a lot of consternation. And they have to decide, do we give in to the nations or do we not? So what's fascinating about this inside the United States is a great way to think about this is the story of polygamy when it comes to Mormonism. We look at it and go, oh yeah, polygamy was banned and so the Mormons were bad. But here's the thing you have to remember. When Joseph Smith first instituted polygamy, Joseph and Brigham were first starting that, polygamy wasn't banned. There was no law against polygamy in America. So what they were doing was well within the laws. It wasn't until later when people said, hey, the Mormons are got these weird practices, we need to persecute them. That's when the laws changed. And so the laws shifted to exclude the Mormons. And that's where a lot of the conflict came in. The laws changed after Mormonism emerged. And so as America was growing and forming and expanding and doing things, Mormonism was growing and expanding at the same time. And then the law said, we don't like Mormonism, we're going to shift. And now Mormonism is banned, which caused the Mormons to leave America. And then America later came and took over that area and brought them back into the nation. And then there had to be some reconciling and things that happened, and polygamy went away because of that. So it's just interesting, that dynamic of how this comes together. So in England's a little unique in how this is formed, because if you think about it, England goes back to the ideas of the Roman legions that conquered the areas up into the British Isles, and they originally had, during the classic era of Roman times, it was mainly more of a paganistic idea. But after we get into the Byzantine empires, which is kind of the remnant of Rome, and we get into the idea of Emperor Constantine taking over, he switches this late Roman empire into Christian beliefs, Christian ideas. The late Roman Empire basically adopts Christianity as their allowed religion. And then as those legions go out, that eventually spreads Christianity through the rest of Europe, up into the British Isles. And then as these groups started to coalesce and form, as Roman law, the Byzantine Empire and all those fell apart, and these nations started to break off into different groups and form their own national identities that we would know today as like the Saxons in France and the Celtics up in Germany and other places like that. Normans went over to British Isles and things. Christianity stayed and started to grow and do things. So Christianity and English history emerged together. Basically, Christianity predates it, but Christianity and English law and history kind of emerge at the same time as we get the split between Catholicism and Greek Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox. They start to split and change. So it's just fascinating how all this happens. Now, they emerge about the same time, and we can see this even in the Magna Carta, the idea of state and religion have a unification. They're mutually supportive of each other. But later that starts to shift as power struggles happen. Some of the kings started to say, I want to exert more authority. That the religion used to say, the religion came out and said, basically, like Pope Gregory talked about this in some of his edicts, and he mentions that religion, because it is divine and of God, it has God's authority, therefore it's a superior authority than the state. And so the religion has the ability to depose state leaders who are bad. Well, the state sometimes doesn't like this, because they're like, no, what if I want to reign? I should be the ruling party here. The only reason your religion is here is because I allow it. Therefore, we should take over. And so over the centuries, there's this back and forth. And a classic one we hear a lot about, of course, is King Henry VIII. He has a huge clash with the Pope. And so he says, you know what? I'm going to break off from the Catholic Church, and I'm going to start a new religion that is a state-sponsored religion within our kingdom, and we're going to push the Catholics out and persecute them, thus creating the Church of England, that is has some autonomy, but is governed by Parliament, by the government of England. So it just, this whole dynamic now shifts as a new religion emerged as a state-sponsored religion with different ideas and views, and they push Catholicism out. So a different version of Christianity starts to emerge, and this is, of course, then there's Protestantism and other things start to emerge. So it's just a fascinating time of history where this idea of pluralism of religion starts to really take off as this thing. The Catholics don't like the Protestants because the Protestants claim the Catholics are wrong. So the Catholics want to persecute the Protestants, but then they can't quite do it. And then the Protestants still emerge and do well. And the Church of England likes the idea of the Protestantism because they're going out, they're the enemy of my enemy is my friend type idea with the Catholic Church. And so it's just it's a wild time. Uh, what's interesting though is in England, religious pluralism isn't liked a whole lot. The Church of England is kind of seen as the big deal, the main church, and any threats against it are seen as a secondary threat to the state because Church of England is kind of the state-sponsored religion to an extent, and so they don't like pluralism up there. They kind of pushed the Puritans out, which is why they sailed across the ocean to America and settled out in America, which led to, of course, Protestantism moving that way as well. And then we get the Americans, colonies, and things starting to form. So it's just cool how all this starts to come together and work out. So law and religion have this interplay with each other that happens all the time. And it's an interesting dynamic that I'm exploring through this paper, that we see where sometimes certain laws and certain religious ideas sometimes take precedence, sometimes they work together. Like the idea of honesty. I mentioned this in the paper, that the idea of honesty is a good one. Honesty is seen as an important religious perspective, a religious view, because lying is deceit, and that is a sin. So honesty is honored as a religious virtue, whereas lying is a sin. So those are good things. Now, inside a nation, having honesty, meaning obeying the laws, being a good person, is what the state wants, because you're going to follow the rules and follow along and be a good member of the state. So in this way, religion and law come together. We want to punish liars and cheats. We don't punish the honest. We just let them live in society and do stuff, but we punish the other side. So we can see where religion and law come together. But yet, in the case of a war, okay, let's say like England declares war against Germany in World War I and II. So here's an interesting clash between state and religion. Religions encourage peace. Religions encourage working together, loving your neighbor. But when they're attacked by Germany and they have to help defend France and help out with things, they're saying, no, we need, as a state, we need to go to war, which means our members need to go fight. But what if your members believe that religious views of nonviolence is more important? And so you have now conscientious objectors to the war, and then a whole big of challenges and things. Can a state make their people go to war even if they disagree with it? All kinds of challenges. So you can kind of see where there's this tension that builds and interrelates between religion and state and laws over time. So it's a fascinating idea that evolves. And because England is so central in the idea of Catholicism and then Protestantism and ideas, and pushing all, encouraging people to end up, accidentally encouraging people, I should say, to go to America, to form America and create more religious pluralism over there, that England has a unique role in this history. So now we're getting into, I got to write a paper this weekend. The first 7 pages of my paper is going to talk about these dynamics and the history of religion and law in England and these ideas, because that's kind of the first part of a research paper is a little bit of known as what's called a historiography. And what this is kind of the state of the research. So what is the state of the scholarship? What have other people said about these concepts and ideas? What else is being talked about out there? What's the conversation around these ideas? Let's talk about that and then frame in there, here's what all the other scholars are saying. Here's what's being talked about. Here's where this paper can contribute to this conversation. Here's where this paper fits within the scholarship of what's happening. So that helps to just here's where the context of why this paper is an important paper to read and to research. And that'll help people go, oh, okay, that is interesting. I want to see more. So hopefully even me explaining those concepts and ideas of laws of religion to you on this video help you to go, oh, that's really interesting. I kind of want to see what happens when we start to look at the clash between LDS beliefs and English law in the 20th century. And how does that affect religious worship for the LDS saints? That's the rest of the paper that I'm still researching and looking into and doing those things. We'll talk about that in subsequent weeks. But that's what I'm working on this week for that class. We had a fun conversation in my mediation class this week as well, as we're talking about how to ask good questions. When you are in a mediation, when there's people in conflict, it's important to realize that when people are in conflict, they are coming at the conflict from different perspectives. And we kind of get that on at face level, but I don't think we realize how important that concept is. And so in this class, we've been taking some concepts and ideas from another discipline called neuro linguistic programming, or NLP, which I happen to have actually kind of a master's certificate in neuro linguistic programming. I've done it for over 20 years myself, and so it's kind of fun to go like, oh yeah, that's right. These fun concepts from NLP are now coming in with mediation, and this is really fascinating because when you think about it, okay, your brain has to take information in. Your brain has no senses by itself. Your eyes, your ears, nose, mouth, your skin, your sense of feel and everything, all of those are sensory organs, and they gather data and send it to the brain. The brain then takes that data, organizes it into a representation of what's happening around us. Okay, so visual, auditory, kinesthetic, which is like your feelings, as well as sensations and emotions and things, pulls all this information together and then runs it through what we call your perceptual filters. So now that the sensory organs have gathered the data, the brain pulls it together and then says, now, how do we make sense of this information? That's where your perceptual filters come in. And so your perceptual filters are things like, what do you believe in? What are you afraid of? What do you believe you're capable of doing and not doing? Those are perceptual filters that affect what's happening around you. So let me give an example of how this works. Okay, if you are walking down the street and a gentleman that happens to be kind of a pretty big guy is walking towards you, and he's looking at you, and like he has this intent to come at you. Okay, different people are going to interpret this differently. And that's because of these perceptual filters. If you are a man and you see this other guy that's a little bit bigger than you, kind of focused on you, coming to you, you're probably going to see him as a threat, a physical threat of, oh my gosh, this guy's going to like beat me up or try to pickpocket me or something. Oh, that might be bad. If you are a woman, you may look at this guy as he's going to maybe take advantage of me. He's going to abuse me in some way. That's not going to be good. So, a man might think, how do I either escape or how do I fight this guy? A woman might be thinking the same thing, but more of how do I avoid him and not have to fight and deal with him at all. So just your gender is going to shift the perception of what's happening with this. Now, we are making assumptions of what this guy's intention is. We don't know yet what his real intention is, but it's those perceptual filters that are going to shift things. Now, if you've been in a fight, if you've been ambushed before, if you've been abused before, this might set off some alarms in your brain, and you're going to overemphasize other things to get around this guy. You may so hyper focus on this guy, you don't even realize that there's somebody behind you going, hello, how are you doing? And and he might be actually, you think he's looking at you, but he's actually looking at the person behind you. Like his wife is coming up behind you or something. Or a friend, you just happen to be in that, you just happen to be right there in his line of sight. So we're going to prepare ourselves for what we think is coming. This is called a map of reality. So we take these perceptual filters, we run the experience through it. Have we experienced something like this before? Do we have any beliefs or ideas or resources to help deal with these? Let's make assumptions of what it is, and then this is how we're going to respond. So when the information gets through the filters, that is what's going to determine the meaning. And that meaning is what determines our response. Do we panic? Do we close up our fists and get ready to take on this guy? Do we wave and smile back at him? All of that is determined by the meaning that we make of what might be happening. So this is what we do instantaneously all the time in our life. We're constantly making meaning and adjusting and doing things. So when it comes down to understanding our perceptions, when someone's in conflict, their perceptual filters are going to distort what really happened. And a lot of times you're going to have the person who if there is a person that has a clear negative to it, like they said something that was mean and it hurt the other person's feelings, oftentimes the person who might have some faults in this is going to diminish the fault and make it sound like they weren't at fault. And we see this sometimes with little kids. If little kids are like getting into an argument and one of them like pushes the other one down, the one that falls down is going to be crying and upset, and you're going to go look at that and he's going to say, he pushed me down. And he's going to make it sound like it was way worse push than it ever was, because he wants to accentuate it's his fault. He pushed me down. The one that did the pushing is going to de-emphasize, I didn't push him, I just touched him like very lightly and he fell over. And so in their mind, again, their perceptual filters are, oh my gosh, I did something out of anger and they got hurt and now I'm going to get in trouble, and so I'm going to minimize my story of culpability so that I can hopefully avoid getting into trouble. This perceptual filter stuff works, and even adults still do it. If you get in a car accident, you're going to find a reason to blame the other person. It's a natural reaction that we have, a natural man tendency, if you will. So definitely something we need to overcome. So in a conflict, both sides are going to do this. So as a mediator, you have to think about what is the perspective of both sides. Okay, as a mediator, it's important for you to not determine who's right, who's wrong, so much as it is understand what are these two perspectives, and then where might be the truth be in between them. And how can we help them understand where that truth might lie and how to work together and let them work it out. Sometimes these can be clear, like this person punched this person. Okay, there's a clear right and wrong in there. But oftentimes in these conflicts, there's not a clear delineation of right and wrong. It's a he said, she said type thing. There's an argument, there's a discussion, and these two need to figure out what they're going to do about it. There isn't like a clear, like you broke a commandment or a law of the land type thing. It's an opinion versus opinion. And so we have to be willing to look at both sides and understand both sides and help them be willing to look at each other's side and see the humanity of each other. And as they do that, they'll come up with their own conclusions and their own understanding of what to do about it. So as a mediator, it's important to ask good questions, to think about how can we adjust what we're doing. How can we get them to think different? How can we take this map of reality that they have that currently has a part of the map that hates the other person, and how do we turn that so that they start to go, oh, yeah, we can come together. They are a human like me. We're in the same boat instead of in separate boats. So asking good questions is how you do that. You're not trying to tell them what's right and what's wrong. You're trying to help them think about it. So sometimes you're going to ask questions that will challenge their map of reality, that will question what they have done or how the facts and details, in their opinion, have worked out. Sometimes you're going to see where there's limiting information, like there's holes in their story. So you can ask questions about what is in those holes to fill those gaps in. And maybe that'll help them to go, oh yeah, there's actually more. Well, okay, so maybe I said something wrong, and that encouraged the problem or whatever. So people are gonna, when people have their own stories, they're gonna delete certain pieces of information. They'll distort other pieces of information. Sometimes they'll just overgeneralize stuff because it's easier and simpler for their brain to wrap around it. So our job is to unravel some of that, to help them find where really is the reality, the truth between these two opinions and ideas, and how do we help them realize that, guys, you can agree to disagree, but let's learn to get along and work together on things. So that's what transformative mediation is about, and those are some of the things we've talked about a lot, is how to ask good questions, how to help understand where these perceptual filters that the people are using are getting in the way of them working together. Even if it means they still are apart, they don't work together anymore, but they can become amicable and not hate each other, basically. That's the goal of transformative mediation. So like in a divorce situation, it's not about how do we get them back to be married, it's how do I help these two people stop acting like children? How do I help them to realize the other person is valid just as you are, and we need to work together. We need to help out for the two of you's sake, and for the if there's kids in the middle too, especially, to help them have a better experience. So some fun stuff we've got to talk about and discuss this week. So it was really fun, and a good experience. So yeah, so if you have questions or comments, put them in the comments section, and we will respond and converse with you there. And if not, we'll see you next week.